The war is not winding down. It is widening, deepening, and getting more expensive for everyone. Let me give you the full picture. So the hook followed immediately by the body source by army as requested. What you are watching right now is not just a war. It is the slow, grinding dismantling of the post-Cold War world order playing out in real time, one drone at a time. And here is what most of the mainstream coverage is not telling you. When Russia launched 659 drones and 44 missiles at Ukraine's major cities, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, in a single 24-hour period just 2 weeks ago, killing a 12-year-old boy in his own home and burning residential buildings to the ground, this was not a battlefield operation. This was a message. And while Ukraine absorbs those blows on the receiving end, it is sending its own message back. I think it's not at cities, but at something far more critical, the financial bloodstream of the Russian war machine. Ukrainian drones struck the Tuapse oil refinery in southern Russia on April 28th, causing a massive fire at a Rosneft facility that has now been hit 3 times in less than 2 weeks. The refinery halted production entirely on April 16th because drone damage to the port made it impossible to ship its output. So there was a scene in Ensimarobat. That is not random. That is surgical economic warfare. And when you understand what is truly at stake, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but for global energy markets, for the balance of power in Europe, for the credibility of American leadership, and for the future of international law itself, you begin to realize that this conflict is not a distant regional skirmish. It is the hinge point of the 21st century. Stay with me because this goes much deeper than the headlines suggest. Let us start with what is actually happening on the ground and why it matters far beyond the borders of Ukraine. On April 16th, Russia unleashed a massive drone and missile barrage on major Ukrainian cities, killing at least 16 people and injuring scores. 4 people died in Kyiv alone, including that 12-year-old child. 9 people were killed in Odessa when Russia struck a high-rise residential building, and Dnipro came under heavy fire for the second time that same week. Think about that for a moment. Dnipro, a city of nearly 1 million people, targeted twice in 1 week. Now, here is the question that nobody in the comfortable studios of American cable news seems to want to sit with. What does it mean when a nuclear-armed state repeatedly and deliberately strikes civilian apartment buildings, kills children in their beds, and then walks into diplomatic meetings and talks about peace? What does that tell us about the nature of the adversary, and what does it tell us about the nature of the system that is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of behavior? Because here is the diplomatic reality that runs alongside all this destruction. Donald Trump made securing a peace agreement a stated priority of his administration, with his special envoy suggesting an agreement within 100 days in office. That deadline came and went. In March 2025, Ukraine agreed to a 30-day partial ceasefire, but Putin said a full ceasefire required certain conditions to be met first, including addressing what Moscow calls the root causes of the conflict, which is just diplomatic language for demanding Ukraine surrender territory and abandon sovereignty. On April 9th, Putin announced a 32-hour ceasefire for the Orthodox Easter weekend. Within hours of it taking effect, both sides accused the other of violations. By Easter morning, Ukraine had recorded over 2,299 alleged Russian ceasefire violations, so the ceasefire was announced, celebrated in press releases, and then immediately shredded. That is the pattern. That has always been the pattern. And yet the attacks keep coming with an industrial regularity that should alarm anyone paying attention. Between January and May 2025, Russian drone strikes averaged about 120 per day. From May to August, that number climbed to 185 per day. Russia is not slowing down. It is scaling up. Russia is producing Shahed-type drones, known domestically as Gerons, and has opened a new production line at the Izhevsk electromechanical plant. By June 2026, Russian production capacity reached approximately 170 Shahed-type drones per day, roughly 5,100 per month. This is not improvisation. This is industrialized war. And the sheer volume tells you something important. Russia is not fighting to win a battle. Russia is fighting to exhaust a society. The strategy is attrition, not has the not of armies, but of civilian endurance, of heating systems, of power grids, of the will of ordinary people to withstand another winter without electricity and warmth. Now, let us talk about Ukraine's counter strategy, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating from a strategic standpoint. Ukraine cannot match Russia drone for drone. It cannot absorb these blows indefinitely without fighting back at a level that changes Russia's calculus. So Kyiv has made a decision, and it is a bold one. Rather than trying to shoot down every incoming drone, which is expensive and ultimately unsustainable, Ukraine has taken the fight to the source of Russia's capacity to wage war, its energy export revenue. According to insurance industry data, Ukrainian strikes cost the Russian oil sector over 1 trillion rubles, roughly $12.9 billion, in losses in 2025 alone. Ukraine carried out 120 attacks on Russian energy facilities that year, with oil refineries accounting for 81 of those strikes. Read those numbers again. 81 strikes on oil refineries. That is not a campaign. That is a siege. And the cumulative effect is beginning to show in ways that matter at the level of financial viability, not just physical damage. In April 2023, before Ukraine's large-scale campaign against Russian refining infrastructure began, each ton of Russian crude generated petroleum products with a profit margin of around 72%. By November 2025, that margin had collapsed to just 22%, or by a threefold decline in profitability in under 2 years. Now, Russia is an enormous country with enormous buffer capacity, and it would be dishonest to suggest that these strikes have brought Russia to its knees. They have not. But the trajectory matters, the direction of travel matters. And when you combine shrinking refinery margins with Western sanctions, with declining domestic consumption growth, with the cost of maintaining a massive standing military operation, the picture that emerges is of a state slowly burning through its financial cushion. The latest strikes on two apps crystallize exactly what this campaign looks like in practice. The two apps refinery belongs to Rosneft and has been hit 3 times in April 2026 alone. After another major refinery at Novorossiysk was heavily damaged earlier in April, Rosneft began diverting oil supplies to two apps, which then became the new target. Ukraine essentially forced Russia to consolidate its export flows and then struck the consolidation point. Black rain fell on two apps and a nearby beach resort following the April 20th attack, leaving oily residue on surfaces. After the latest strike, over 30 residents near the refinery were evacuated and more than 200 firefighters were deployed to fight the blaze, and dense black smoke was reportedly visible from Sochi, 80 kilometers away. This is not a minor industrial incident. This is a strategic asset being systematically degraded. Now, here is where I want you to think about the broader geopolitical architecture, because the war in Ukraine does not exist in a vacuum. Ukraine has stepped up its attacks on Russian energy targets since March, with American brokered peace talks on pause and Washington mainly focusing on the Iran war. That sentence deserves to be read very carefully. Washington is focused on Iran. The Strait of Hormuz has become a crisis point. The effective shutdown of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the biggest energy security threat in history, with one analysis suggesting the closure so far is the equivalent of 1 billion barrels of oil missing from the global economy. So you have simultaneous disruptions to Russian oil export infrastructure from Ukrainian drones and disruptions to Middle Eastern oil flows from the Iran situation. These two crises are happening at the same time. And the global oil market is absorbing both shocks simultaneously. What does that mean for prices? What does that mean for the cost of filling your tank in Ohio or Texas? What does that mean for the inflation trajectory in the United States? These things are connected. They are not separate stories on separate pages. They are chapters of the same story. And then there is the diplomatic theater, which deserves its own close examination. According to data from Russia's independent Levada Center in December 2025, public support for continuing the war fell to its lowest level since 2022, just 25%, while 66% of Russians favored a transition to peace negotiations. 66% of ordinary Russian citizens want peace talks. And yet the drone factories keep running. The missiles keep flying. The apartment buildings in Odessa and Kyiv keep burning. What does that tell you about the relationship between public opinion and political decision-making in Russia? What does it tell you about the nature of the system that Zelensky and Biden and now Trump have all been trying to negotiate with? You are not dealing with a democratic state that can be pressured through its population. You are dealing with a structure where one man's strategic calculus overrides the preferences of 66% of his own people. At this stage, neither side has achieved its strategic objectives, and the conflict has entered a phase of protracted confrontation. Russia remains confident it can achieve its goals through military means, while Ukraine relies on its capacity to endure. That is the essential deadlock. Russia believes time is on its side, Ukraine believes survival is on its side, and the rest of the world, including the United States, is caught in between, providing weapons and money and diplomatic support while also trying to negotiate an exit that does not reward aggression and does not not abandon a people fighting for their existence as a nation. In the April 25th attack, the city of Dnipro was hardest hit with 8 people killed and 49 wounded, including 2 children. The deputy mayor of Dnipro was nearly killed. A 1-year-old boy was among the wounded in the Kharkiv region. Strikes also hit Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, and Odessa. 1-year-old, let that sit with you for a moment. These are not statistics. These are children who will carry these events in their bodies and their memories for the rest of their lives, assuming they survive to have lives. And the scale of it, Ukraine's Air Force recorded 619 Russian drones and 47 missiles launched in that single overnight attack. Stikis and da is simply staggering when you let yourself truly absorb it. So where does this leave us? What is the honest assessment of where this war is headed and what it means for Americans specifically? First, understand that the energy dimension of this conflict has direct implications for your household budget. Every successful Ukrainian strike on a Russian refinery is a piece of data that flows into the global commodities market. Combined with the Iran situation, you are looking at an energy supply landscape that is tighter and more volatile than it has been in a generation. Second, understand that the diplomatic stalemate is not a failure of effort, but a reflection of a genuine conflict of interest that no amount of clever deal-making can paper over. Russia wants to absorb Ukrainian territory and neutralize Ukraine as a Western-oriented state. So, Ukraine wants to exist as a sovereign country within its internationally recognized borders. These positions are not currently bridgeable, and the bombs falling on Dnipro and Odessa are Russia's way of trying to force a capitulation that the negotiating table has not yet produced. Third, in this instance, and this is perhaps the most important thing, what is happening in Ukraine is a test of whether international law, territorial sovereignty, and the principle that borders cannot be changed by force still mean anything in the 21st century. Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom are all signatories to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which provided security assurances to Ukraine in exchange for Kiev giving up the Soviet nuclear arsenal it inherited. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons based on promises. Those promises have been broken in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Every government in the world that is watching this, every small or medium-sized state that faces a more powerful neighbor, is drawing conclusions about what American security guarantees are actually worth and about whether following international rules makes you safer or more vulnerable. That is the deeper moral stakes of this conflict. That is why it matters to you sitting here in the United States, far from the burning buildings in Kyiv and the black rain falling on Tuapse. The world you live in, the rules that structure international behavior, the credibility of the alliances your country has built over 80 years, all of it is being tested right now by these drones and these missiles and these refinery fires. And the outcome is far from decided.